буде кидати і своїх людей на смерть, і інші держави тощо. І втягне НАТО в війну, він втягне обов'язково. І американські солдати, я точно вам кажу, що є велика загроза, що потім американські солдати будуть вимушені захищати країни НАТО. Бо Польща, Прибалти – це перші, хто під ударом, хто під загрозою. І тому Конгресу треба зберегти не тільки життя українців, і зберегти і своє американське майбутнє, свої сім'ї. А для цього потрібно допомагати сьогодні Україні, тим, хто дійсно єдині, хто сьогодні воює.
Good afternoon and welcome to the channel. I'm Brian Lusk. Thank you for joining me today. That was President Zelensky in an interview with CBS News discussing the realities behind what would happen if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine. And one of those realities that would happen, it's not that I know that some people on a certain side of the political aisle will declare that this just means that Zelensky is threatening the West, that he's saying that they'll have to put their troops and soldiers in. No, what President Zelensky is identifying is that Russia will not stop in Ukraine, and that provocations against NATO countries are already happening, including missiles over Poland, the non-NATO country of Moldova getting several drones impacting its territory as well, that there's indications that Russia is working on trying to destabilize the Baltics and create a casus belli there. There's all kinds of information that indicates that Russia is absolutely intending to continue their war efforts effectively as much as they can into the future. That does not mean that they couldn't potentially stop for a little while as part of a peace deal, but as we've seen in Chechnya and we've seen in Georgia, whenever Russia is forced to retreat and is defeated on the battlefield, they lick their wounds with the peace agreements they can make, and then they come back again in short order. So it's really clear that there is a consistent and persistent pattern to how Russia operates. They will not stop unless they're forced to stop, and then prevented from starting again. Hi, Jerry and Lucille. Glad to have you on board. I was just talking about President Zelensky's interview with CBS News here. Ozzy, glad to have you here as well. Thank you for joining. So we got the whole crew, it seems like, this morning so far. This afternoon, I should say. And anyway, he had this interview with CBS News. And the other thing I wanted to point out is you note the location that Zelensky does his interviews in. He doesn't sit in gold filigreed rooms with long tables and microphones and huge staffs and all this finery and all these things when he gives an interview. He sits in the places where the destruction is happening. He often will go too close to the front lines and sit down with these people for these interviews so they can see for themselves exactly the nature of the attacks that are taking place. Vladimir Putin, of course, declared it's insane that there's any chance that Russia would attack Europe itself. He said that Russia didn't plan to attack Ukraine, but was forced to. Well, you know what? He's already setting up forced twos for attacking Europe. And we all know that those forced twos are not really forced twos. They're made up in his head so that he has a reason to go to war, something he can put onto the world stage as a reason for his actions. And the problem is that there is no reason behind them. There is no true goal beyond power and recovering the lost Soviet Union behind it. Now let's go ahead and get into some of the interesting news from the last day and a half or so. There was a significant bombardment overnight of between 58 and 60 Shahed drones, some Kazals, some Iskanders, some Kh-59 cruiser missiles, some Kh-101 and 555 air-launched missiles. A significant number were intercepted. And Null reports the flight paths are kind of interesting, indicating something new, or let me rephrase that, a different level of targeting on the Russian side. It shows that they're looking to seek to hit targets in the western part of Ukraine more and more, which means they're planning routes to get around the air defense systems in any way they can, going at it at unusual angles. You can see like a curve right here before it goes into this city, which I have to admit I have not pre-interpreted the city names here. That looks like it's around Lviv area, but I'm not sure, to be honest. The overall situation, though, is that it's clear that Russia is looking for those strategic facilities and for the energy infrastructure that powers the country to look for to hit it repeatedly. This is becoming their pattern once again. They've already damaged a couple of hydroelectric power plants, some thermal plants. They're going after the energy infrastructure once more. Anton Herashchenko reports that 84 air targets were destroyed. However, the attack resulted in damage to energy infrastructure in Dnipropetrovsk, Vinnytsia, Ivanovo-Frankivsk, Lviv, Cherkasy, and Chernivtsi regions. So that's the situation there. Russia is continuing to attack energy infrastructure and civilian targets extensively as things go forward. Dara Masakat has reported that more strikes were against Ukrainian critical infrastructure overnight, with the goal being to create secondary effects. In other words, making these cities unlivable and forcing residents to flee or leave at large scale. This results in humanitarian crises. It means that even more people are running across borders into Europe itself, creating additional crises over in Europe. This is intended to destabilize the country and cause Ukraine to crumble under the weight of these attacks. In other news, there was video that appeared online of a Su-20. Well, I'm going to prevaricate for just a moment there on this. That's been reported as being a Su-27 and a Su-35. My belief at this point is that it was actually a Su-27 based on ongoing reports as we continue on. The aircraft, the pilot apparently ejected and was recovered about 200 meters off the in front of the Sevastopol coastline, and the only injury being that of the plane itself. This has been reported by Russian media and multiple other sources, so we know that a warplane did crash. But even the Kiev Post has reported it was a Su-35 and that it was a friendly fire incident. They do, multiple sources, including Russian, do state a Su-35, but the more I've looked into it and the more I've kind of patched into additional sources, it really does look like it was a Su-27 that ended up falling from the sky. Anton Herashchenko did his research and his homework and came back with the report that it was a Su-27, and that it was shot down basically shortly after takeoff by a Russian Pantsir anti-aircraft missile gun system or air defense system. The report is that when the Pantsir crew did an IFF query, they did not receive a response back, and therefore they decided to fire on the plane. However, it turned out when they double-checked all the systems and hardware that their IFF interrogator was actually busted. That is why a Su-27 fell from the skies over Crimea. Moving on to another item I want to focus on for a moment from the international front, and this comes from the New York Times via Jason J. Smart, journalist. He states that it is clear as day, if Kiev falls, then Taipei will also fall. Every gain for Russia is a victory for China, Iran, and North Korea. This is coming based on Taiwan's top diplomat saying that U.S. aid to Ukraine is critical for deterring China. That's right. Taiwan is saying that they are seeing indications that China is watching what happens in Ukraine very closely, and they're watching for opportunities that this may in fact present for them to in fact take over Taiwan once more. I always kind of the one thing I do say to myself when this comes up is that we probably ought to support the one China policy as long as China realizes that the legitimate government of China actually was exiled to Taiwan, and thus that should be the legitimate government of all of China. But so far, nobody's taken me up on that suggestion. The indications that China is seriously watching how things are going here and intend to possibly make use of it. Now, I mentioned the other day that there was a model of the road system around the Taiwan presidential palace. Well, something else bumped up here from Chris O that was really interesting, and that is that these China videos have been put in play that they've been putting out show a model of the Eiffel Tower as well. And certainly the Chinese military potentially training for something involving Paris is should indicate exactly how widespread their views truly are. Do I believe they're not exactly working a mock-up of Paris cities or something like that, but the fact that we're seeing the Eiffel Tower there, they might be putting some threats out there, at least subconsciously, as part of their efforts. Let's go ahead and move on to the news out of Ukraine itself. The SBU detained a Russian agent who was collecting data to help the occupiers adjust a missile attack on the TPP and a military hospital in Dnipro. He was a 22-year-old local resident, but has been charged with treason. Now, we have seen some of those treason cases starting to come to actual completion in the courts. I believe that some of them have received 8 and 10 and 12 years as far as their punishment, their time in prison. I don't remember exactly right now, but we are starting to see those come through. During the CBS News interview, Zelensky reported that they expect a new Russian offensive in May or June, and this is when they expect their next major offensive from Russia to occur. According to the Kiev Independent, almost 1,800 Ukrainian children have been made orphans by Russia's war in Ukraine. That is quite a number. That is a lot of kids who have lost both their parents in this horrific war of aggression on Russia's part. An interesting report's been coming out of Ukraine. According to the various reports we're seeing, the Patriot and SAMP-T air defense systems are able to shoot down the Zircon hypersonic missiles, which would indicate that Russia's hypersonics are not as undefeatable as they like to say they are. Ozzy, I love that comment, Free West Taiwan. Anyway, so it looks like even these systems from the 80s and 90s are able to intercept and take down Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles. Presumably that's going to be based on the intercept angles they can create, whether the Patriot or SAMP-T systems are placed properly for such an intercept. But even so, that's indicating that our old tech is able to take out Russia's finest and latest. And slightly more sobering news, 121 fallen Ukrainian soldiers were returned to Ukraine as part of repatriation. The bodies of the dead will be delivered to the relevant state institutions, identified, and then the final burials will take place. Moving on to the news out of Russia. We kind of, with all the drone strikes happening on like energy infrastructure in Russia, the oil depots, the oil refineries and things like that, kind of lost is that there's still other strike attempts happening with drones in Russia itself, including this downed UAV that was found in the Moscow region. Just kind of interesting to keep track of the fact that these things are still going on. Now, according to the Institute for the Study of War, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has released its 38th report on the human rights situation in Ukraine on March 26th, confirming several of the ISW's long-standing assessments about Russia's systemic violations of international human rights and humanitarian law in the occupied territories and toward Ukrainian prisoners of war. We've seen the pictures in the video repeatedly of both individuals and prisoners of war being tortured and treated in ways that are in contravention to these agreements. It's not a surprise, unfortunately. I mean, really, truly, unfortunately, not a surprise at all to have this confirmed that from the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission that these are taking place. Kind of moving down to the little bit farther down this one, Russian officials are tying the United States and the West to a broader set of terrorist acts against Russia following the Crocus City Hall attack. This is likely for rhetoric purposes. They're trying to throw the West back a little bit, saying they're supporting these terrorist attacks, though mostly this is intended for a domestic audience, not for those of us in the West who really know better than that. That said, I have been going through Twitter, and there are plenty of people in the West that have latched onto Russia's words as though they are gospel and are therefore believing that Ukraine and therefore the West is behind these terrorist attacks. That said, the Russians always provide this without any actual proof. Vladimir Putin is attempting to force the integration of the temporarily occupied territories into Russia. This includes the enforcing people to get Russian passports, which if they don't have by July 1st, they will no longer have the right to live in those territories. From the Ministry of Defense of the UK, this one I'm going to summarize because it's a lot here, but basically Russia's having so much trouble finding administration and personnel for their occupied territories that they're having to set up an actual basically public administration college course and put these people through a state and municipal management course in order to set up the administrators for various levels of government in these areas, such as in Donetsk and Luhansk. This indicates that, number one, they're not getting the people in those territories to sign up for those jobs, which indicates overall that the existing administrations of those areas were not willing to work with Russia in the end. So they're trying to set up a way to quickly stand up administration personnel in these territories, including with a master's program to set this up because they don't have willing volunteers to step into those roles. Russia's recruiting continues to work very well for them because they've basically created an economic situation where people have no other option than to take the much higher wages for going in the military compared to what they can get in their hometowns. Found this one interesting. The combined total of losses for foreign companies that exited Russia since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has now exceeded $107 billion, according to various companies' financials. This overall, they were obviously, if you're going to work inside Russia, you're taking that risk with the understanding of the governments there. But they have taken significant losses by getting out of Russia, mainly in losses of equipment, infrastructure, and the various ways that Russia is charging them to leave. Russia's taking their anti-ship cruise missiles and reworking them to make them into ground attack missiles. They're using them because they want to try and make them strike with greater accuracy, according to Russia's state-owned media, TASS. Another oil refinery near the center of Samara has been halted production after damage from Ukrainian drones. We've seen a significant portion of Russia's oil infrastructure attacked and their refining capacity drop markedly, I believe up to 14%, based on the numbers I've seen. In fact, as I recall, I'm going to pause here for a moment. I might have this again later. But my recollection is that Russia has had to net import from Belarus for their oil needs because Belarus still has working refinery capacity. So, according to Kirill Budanov and according to other sources in the West, Russia knew about the Crocus Music Hall attack in advance, and that they were aware of the routes through which the terrorists intended to enter Russia. And the question then becomes, why weren't they stopped? Now, this is according to Kirill Budanov. He's generally been pretty accurate with his statements. But he is the Ukrainian intelligence chief, so you might well take that with a slight grain of salt. Russia's bombed itself yet again with another aerial bomb dropped on the Belgorod region, a Fab 500, discovered near the village of Besanovka. Russia's Roscosmos has lost 80% of its income as other nations have refused to jump on board with using their rockets to get into space. So they're now selling commercial advertisements on Russian spaceships, rockets, and satellites, along with other space infrastructure objects. Basically, they're putting billboards on their stuff before they lift them off into space. Here's the bit about the increase in gas imports from Belarus. There was a sharp increase in January of 2024, no shipments from Belarus to Russia. In February, 590 tons were sent. And in March, the first half of March, 3,000 tons were sent from Belarus to Russia. This has been a big priority for Minsk because, let's cut to the chase, Belarus is basically in Russia's satellite orbit there. So we don't know for sure how much Belarus can actually spare and how much additional production capacity they can generate, but that's what we don't know if they can actually meet Russia's needs as they've been losing capacity. Additional information on the Crocus Music Hall attack. Russia has claimed to have found another suspect that was detained in connection with this attack, a financier of that. They then let me see if they actually get this. Okay, I'm going to just stop here for a moment here. They've already claimed that this individual had actually provided their Ukrainian connection with this, again, without providing any actual evidence thereof. The CIA states, though, that they warned Russian security officials that ISIS was preparing a terrorist attack, but did not provide detailed information because they didn't want to reveal their sources. Still, this really states that straight up that the United States, despite viewing Russia as the enemy that it is, despite Russia declaring the U.S. as their enemy and the West as their enemy as a whole, did provide enough information for the Russians to know about this attack in advance. That they poo-pooed it and ignored it is entirely on Russia. And the Wagner-affiliated account Gray Zone, now Wagner is now mostly rolled into the Ministry of Defense, so technically you might consider this a state-owned deal, but it's not absolutely clear exactly what their role is. But they are basically throwing all of the Kremlin under the bus by saying the state news agency RIA Novosti has already confirmed what Gray Zone said immediately after the terrorist attack, that the terrorists were recruited in the closed Telegram chat IS Velayet Khorasan, with its corresponding name. Also, the Turkish news agency Yetkin Report confirmed the terrorists flew to Turkey, where they held meetings with the organizers of the terrorist attack in the Moscow Crocus City Hall concert complex. Again, indicating that ISIS was really behind it, that they were not directly coming from or to Ukraine, and that this whole thing seems to have been arranged through an ISIS actual Telegram account. Moving on to items out of Ruski Mir. According to an intercepted phone call that the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine managed to publish, this statement, they order everyone will vote. I did not want to go, but they forced. A forced vote under gunpoint is no free will at all. And according to the Russian propagandists, they are calling Estonia and Latvia artificial states now. And that means that once again, they're saying that real nations don't exist and that they are artificial so that they can have a reason to march into them and take them over. They're setting the stage to try and normalize this thought process that these nations that have been great allies of Ukraine are, in fact, just Russian puppet states in the end. And other propagandists have stated that they want to restore historical justice by capturing Finland, Poland, Baltic states, and Alaska. They also believe that Serbia will voluntarily join them, which actually matches generally what we're seeing. But this is where Russia's trying to go. They want to normalize this idea that all this territory naturally belongs to Russia, and they will have to, by force of arms, restore it to its natural state of being part of the Russian Federation, or in this case, more like the Soviet Union. Let's go ahead and move on to the international front, but as we do so, if you have any comments, absolutely chime in. I am watching for them. I appreciate every single one and appreciate everything you guys say. I do appreciate as well seeing that we've got several people on and are watching at this time. Thank you for joining me. From the Kiev Independent, the Swedish defense minister says that deliberations are ongoing for the transfer of Gripen fighters to Ukraine. Now, the Gripen fighter is actually an excellent aircraft, especially for the conditions in Ukraine. It's rugged. It was designed for running from rugged or rough airfields. It was intended to be concealed, and the Swedes have a great deal of experience in preparing concealment for these aircraft. They know how to do this in countering Russia. So the Gripen fighters going to Ukraine would be a great addition to Ukraine's air assets. We'll just have to see if it happens. Germany announced another tranche of support, including recovered armored recovery vehicles, Warthog Command armored vehicles, and armored engineer vehicles, ammunition for Leopard tanks, 18,155 millimeter shells, and 24,000, hang on, let me pull this up here, 24,000 rounds of 40 millimeter ammunition, 2,056 anti-tank weapons, RGW-90 Matador, and more. So they're still supporting Ukraine. They just aren't providing them the Taurus missiles yet. Poland is investigating a pro-Kremlin propaganda network linked to Russian intelligence. I kind of took a closer look at this for a bit, and it looks like there's a lot going on for the propaganda front here. We've already seen a lot of the results of that as we've seen, like the farmer strikes and the trucker strikes over in Poland. A lot of those seem to be linked to Russian propaganda. And things to just kind of keep an eye on. Ukraine and Poland have been negotiating over an agreement on joint border control and state that they've found some mutually satisfactory solutions, including to some of the agricultural trade issues that have been on the farmers' minds. The prosecutor's office in the German city of Hamburg announced charges on March 27 against 4 Germans and 1 Swiss national related to the illegal sale of gas turbines to a Russian state-owned company in occupied Crimea. This is amongst the ways of avoiding or evading sanctions that they've got going on. They can get some, in this case, Germans and Swiss on their side, and they can kind of try and shuffle it around to make it go different ways to show up finally in Crimea against sanctions. 2 Ukrainian prisoners of war, which is part of 11 that were handed over to Hungary by Russia, have been released from prison in Hungary, but the condition that they've placed on them is that they will not return to Ukraine until the war ends. This one caught my attention here. Bloomberg says that U.S. is in talks with Turkey for more explosives to boost shell production. So even the U.S. is going out and about looking for additional supplies to stuff into their 155 millimeter artillery shells and the like. Interesting to see, and might indicate some of the issues that the U.S. military-industrial complex might be facing in trying to supply this war. According to sources, the negotiations regarding the Czech Republic's initiative for ammunition have concluded, and they will get up to 1 million shells for Ukraine. Now, there are also reports, and I might have it in here, that the first of those shells may actually arrive in April, which means just a few days or to a couple of weeks. So keep an eye out for those to show up on the front lines. And if this is fully confirmed for Kiev, they may already be taking whatever stockpiles they were reserving and moving them to the front lines to be used on Russian targets. Hi, Tony. Glad to have you on board. It's always wonderful to see you joining us today. The Russian ambassador to Poland, Sergei Andreev, has left the country following an incident involving a Russian missile entering the state's airspace. He was summoned to the foreign ministry to explain this missile showing up in Polish airspace and refused to do so. Now they have invited him to no longer be in Poland, which is what most of these Russian diplomats should be invited to do, as in leave. From the Ukrainian Review, quoting General Ben Hodges, "We spend too much time worrying about the Russians might do. Instead, we should make them worry about what we are capable of." And this is just another indication that instead of being fully invested in helping Ukraine win, we have instead, as the West as a whole, have held back, have tried to not escalate, have tried to avoid making Russia get mad. And yet, the truth is, we have far more military power than Russia can ever bring to bear. And they should be fearing us, not the other way around. Ukraine and the United States have signed a bilateral agreement on the postponement of public debt payments. Basically, kind of like the U.S.'s own interest payments on our public debt. That's really what's stifling everything going on. The Ukraine as a whole is trying to avoid having those payments happen right in the middle of their war, because they'll be able to do more with their money if they don't have to worry about it right now. And that's about the shells we already talked about before. There is one other interesting item that was came out again. Zelensky and U.S. House of Representatives Speaker Johnson had a phone call wherein President Zelensky expressed how vital the necessary air defense missiles and artillery shells are and additional equipment. And there's no report on exact promises that may have come out of it. However, there was some commentary on the hurdles that may be required in order to introduce a Ukraine aid bill to the House. And that is a lot of internal party dynamics on the Republican side, a lot of problems there. There have been a certain MAGA Republican who has declared that she will move to have Johnson removed from the speakership if it turns out that he brings Ukraine aid to the floor. But at this point in time, if Johnson is to maintain his speakership, it really does look like he's going to have to ask the Democrats for help. It's just more chaos on the U.S. House. Let's go ahead and move on to the front lines. General Alexander Syrskyi says that things are better for Ukraine than what many people think. They don't need the full 500,000 people mobilized at this point in time. They've reduced that figure down. They actually they're stating, he says that they've returned more territory to Ukraine, or positions, he said, than they have lost in the recent days. The Russians still maintain a 6-1 advantage in ammunition, but he's tried to give a good report overall of what was going on. He said they withdrew from Avdiivka because Russia had a significant advantage in assault units, and their goals right now are to exhaust Russian advances and prepare their reserves for the offensive in the summertime. War Translated provided a lot more information, and rather than going through all this, I will just drop the link into the comments. More information on the Sirski's commentary here and this interview. A lot of the things that I wanted to point out here is they're working on rotation of military units so they can be rested and refurbished, re-equipped, I should say. And they need people, but they need to do it correctly. They have lots of volunteers coming in, and they are hoping not to have to mobilize an extensive number more. Now, this still means they're going to need to mobilize a lot of people, but a lot of things are going on and potentially positive indications therefrom. As far as actual changes to the front lines, it's been minimal. Novomikhailivka, they've got a little bit more area that's converted from the gray zone to controlled by Russia. This is mostly open territory once again, so it's not a major change there. They are reporting more territory seized inside the village itself or city itself. The Ukraine control map did point out something I didn't see mentioned anywhere else, and that is that a small Ukrainian advance at Hyrivka has retaken some positions near Marinka. I've not seen this reflected on any other maps, but interesting to see happening if so. So I can't absolutely confirm this one, but I just wanted you to know about its report. And that's really the front lines right there. So let's go ahead and continue on to the interesting extra, which is just one item today. And that is that one of the questions that always comes up is exactly how much support does Russia versus Ukraine have in Crimea? And according to the head of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people, Rifat Chubarov, despite the long Russian occupation of Crimea, it has opened the eyes of many who wanted Russia to come to the peninsula. Supporters of Russia remain, as well as about 1 million people who illegally settled in Crimea during the years of occupation. He also noted that these people were becoming more and more anxious and advised them to leave Crimea in advance while the Crimean Bridge was still there. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of people, including Crimean Tatars, ethnic Ukrainians, and others, are waiting for the liberation of Crimea. Russia's full-scale aggression against mainland Ukraine in 2022 gave the people of Crimea hope for the liberation of the peninsula. After all, the world has united around supporting the territorial integrity of Ukraine, including Crimea. In addition, Ukraine has demonstrated the ability to fight back, which was not the case in 2014. He concluded with, "People in Crimea live in hope of liberation." And that's everything for today. Thank you for joining me. I'm glad you are here. If you enjoyed today's video, absolutely hit with that old thumbs up. If you just came in late, feel free to go all the way back to the beginning. I talked about the fall of a Su-27 fighter jet just outside of Sevastopol. I talked about the fact that China is looking at the situation in Ukraine and is already making preparations to potentially involve itself in Taiwan, and even has a replica of the Eiffel Tower on their training range, indicating they may be looking at larger and wider schemes. I also talked about the bombardment of Ukraine, how massive the overnight missile and drone strikes were, and talked about how, of course, Russia was striking energy infrastructure. A lot of stuff in today's video. Not too terribly long, though. We're only about 40 minutes in. Thank you again for joining me, and you have a great rest of your day. We'll see you on the next video.